Hi everyone, Dr. Antonelli back here for our final segment of topic 10 on assessment. This is the slide that says, last but not least, everybody's favorite, standardized tests. Some background information on standardized tests. The people who design these tests often have a specialized training in designing them. These tests have the same items and the same conditions that each test taker is exposed to on them. The same scoring is used for all students who take these tests. Their scores are interpreted by a comparison. This is that norm referenced grading that we talked about, where we compare students' scores who took it in one school, let's say, to another school in the district or across the state. And then the purpose of these standardized tests is to get a real good kind of picture, an overall picture of how students did if they were, let's say, sixth graders that year. And then we use a sample of across the entire state, let's say of New Jersey, all the sixth graders who took this standardized test, we get this representative sample from every sixth grader across the state who took the same test. So this is what is the definition of standardized, that S in RSVP that we had talked about earlier. Okay, why do we need these tests? I know many of you have asked this over your lifetime of being in school, but there are purposes. We really want to use the test to look at students' general academic strengths and weaknesses, and using that information then helps teachers to create instructional plans from it. And it's also, we need them to kind of see how students are doing in reference to their skills and strengths and weaknesses to decide what students may need additional help or inclusion in a special program. Okay, those kinds of things are really valid reasons for the need of standardized tests. There's two types of standardized tests: achievement tests and aptitude tests. Let's talk about the difference between these two. There's actually four kinds of achievement tests that we'll mention in the next slide, but an achievement test is actually a test the student takes which is going to show how much of a subject or skill content that has been learned, basically. So it's testing what students have learned. An aptitude test reveals more about what knowledge and skills could a student acquire if they were instructed properly. So it's almost that predictor test, how well student could be at something or know something in the future if they actually received high quality instruction in this. Okay, so one's testing what we already know, one's testing what we could know in the future as a predictor. Okay, these are the four types of achievement tests I was just talking about. Single subject, by the name itself, it's one particular school subject that's being assessed on that test. So English or math, whatever it might be, one school subject on the single subject test. The achievement battery takes kind of a combination of multiple school subjects. So this battery of tests may include a reading section, a writing section, and a math section. Those are the multiple school subjects. A diagnostic test is that test that's used, let's say, before a student enters a certain grade level or starts a class, so that we can kind of identify from their answers and their scores where their strengths and weaknesses are, to know how to guide our instruction as a teacher. Okay, and then a competency test is one of those tests that we assess how competent someone is in the skills that they've acquired, and it's usually a test that is needed for graduation to see, have you reached the competency levels needed for us to give you this certificate or to give you this type of let's say licensing for something. That's what a competency test is. Okay, when we look at standardized test scores, without getting too heavy into this slide and the next two slides, there are a couple of things that are often used in score reports that teachers are able to take a look at once the score reports come in, that administrators look at and school districts look at. And there's a couple of examples here. Sometimes the scores are reported as a grade equivalent, meaning what grade level does that student's score fall under, based on the criteria for, here's what a fifth grader would know, a sixth grader would know, here's the score of what a seventh grader would know, and where students fall in that grade level. Then there's something called percentile ranks, which is the percentage of students who are at or below a given student's score. I want to show you that here at the bottom of this slide. A percentile rank would be, okay, the student rank in the 60th percentile of the 100% of students who took the test, let's just say. So it's compared to other students. Remember, sometimes statewide, district-wide, and statewide that might use percentile ranks to compare the scores of students. Then there's something called a standard score that's expressed oftentimes in something we call a standard deviation. A standard deviation being, here's the middle or the average score, and where did students score from that middle? How far from one side to the other did a student score? And here's an example of Z-scores and T-scores fall under that category of standard scores. And these Z and T scores, here is the standard. And then how far over did each other student, when we compare them to each other, score as compared to this middle area. Okay, so did they score this way, this way, this way? Did they score this way? I don't want to get too crazy on these because it's not as important for you to know this unless you're going to be really doing the analysis and interpretation. A lot of times this is done on a school level by administration or on a district level. And then teachers are brought in to say, okay, well, here's what I need to do with these scores. Okay. Then there's something called a Stay9 score, which is a standard score that divides the population of students who took the test into 9 groups. I want to show you that here. And these 9 groups all have a percentage of students and how well they did attached to each of those levels. Based on their scores on the test. They are put kind of into these categories or levels. Okay, so just a couple things to think about there. Don't get too crazy. It gets a little, that's more of someone who's doing an analysis of interpretation of test scores. Teachers' main focus is to be able to generally understand where students scored and where their strengths and weaknesses are in order to design their lesson plans to be more effective. Okay, let's look at some relationships between standardized tests and high stakes. What is actually high stakes testing? What does that actually mean? Well, it's taking the standardized test score students receive, whether fully or part of the score, and using it to decide if a student can go to their next grade level, if they can graduate from high school. Those are 2 big things related to students. It also means that teachers and administrators, often in school districts, will receive some sort of financial reward or a demotion based on the scores that students receive. And school districts receive additional state funds or lose their accreditation based on these test scores. And that's what high stakes means related to not only students, but teachers, administrators, and school districts. So there's a lot going on with this relationship here. How are standardized tests related to accountability issues? Well, a couple of historical pieces. In 1983, there was a scathing report on how American students were doing on standardized tests. It was called A Nation at Risk. It basically said we weren't doing that well on this and that we needed to improve our educational system because the test scores are not really reflecting where we should be. So it was holding our public school system accountable in that report, okay? No Child Left Behind Act was in 2001 under President Bush. It was federal legislation that said states must have these kind of standards for math, reading, language arts, and science achievement, and that they must annually test students in grades 3 to 12 in these areas to show that they've met these achievement standards. The states were also required to report the scores and demonstrate what we call AYP, which is known as adequate yearly progress. And of course, if states were not demonstrating AYP and they were kind of falling under the guidelines for what demonstrated that, then they were given, let's say, a punishment to hold them accountable of some sort. And if they did demonstrate AYP, they could be given rewards. So again, depending on the success or failure of the performance of the students in the school district, they would, again, be held accountable for that success or failure with rewards or punishments, okay? There are lots of effects of high stakes testing on a number of different areas. The first one is on achievement. And this is overall, we found positive but very small effects on achievement of high stakes testing on math and reading. And of course, we've always found there's little change between white and minority students. taking tests that are under this high stakes testing umbrella, there's very little effects we see between these groups. Effects on motivation can be positive or negative of high stakes testing. It really does depend on the circumstances. There are effects on teachers and teaching. When it comes to high stakes testing, a lot of times the lessons become more teacher directed, where teachers are starting to teach to the test and do some test prep so that the scores on high stakes tests will increase. Sometimes it's more student centered. And sometimes teachers spend more time with what we call bubble kids. These are the kids who score very close to what the cutoff score is for accountability and for meeting adequate yearly progress. So we want to try to get those bubble kids who are right on the cusp of that cutoff score to be above. And that's one of the effects of spending a little bit more time with those students. Effects on the curriculum, well, more time is always given for math and reading, since these are the tested subjects usually in high stakes tests, and areas like social studies, art, music, gym, and recess are often less time is given to those in the curriculum because they're not tested on high stakes tests. Okay. In addition, we found effects on the dropout rate. It's really hard to tell, but actually we've seen, a bit of an increase in the dropout rate as a result of high stakes testing. We've also seen states lower their standards and actually make some of their tests easier, while other states did not. Okay. Additional effects of high stakes testing include the educational services that are extra. Districts that don't meet the AYP criteria are supposed to offer tutoring, but only about 17% of eligible students who should get that tutoring actually participate. Okay, that's a big one. Additional effects of high stakes testing have to do with reform efforts. Reforms are things that happen as a result of, let's say, the scores on these tests. And one of them is modifications to the No Child Left Behind Act, where states were granted these waivers if they just agreed to improve their instructional quality. And then No Child Left Behind was turned into ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, under President Obama. And that legislation was, was part of this reform effort, about improving instructional quality. Another reform effort as a result of high stakes testing was called Race to the Top, where states were given money in order to implement things like common standards and standardized tests align with things. So that was also in effect. Another effect was the Common Core standards, where states agreed to have these Common Core standards for English language arts and math. And I know we've talked about that in some of our other classes. How can high stakes testing be improved, which can always help teachers? States should adopt the content standards that are most important for their students to learn, okay? And that these states' content standards should really describe what's being assessed so that the teachers can create lessons that directly address those standards. And then on a state assessment, the scores should be reported standard by standard. So if each of the standards has criteria underneath, we should report the scores on the assessment, like how did a student do on this standard versus this standard versus this standard, so that we could see it for each student and we could see it for each school and for each district, which would thereby help us to identify strengths and weaknesses. In addition, we should provide, states as a whole should provide individual school districts with other assessment procedures to assess the standards that weren't required. So in those areas like social studies and science, social studies and PE and other areas that don't require the high stakes testing, okay? Should also monitor the curriculum of the school to make sure it's being addressed, it's addressing the standards, and it should be designed for all students to have equal opportunities, always key. Professional organizations should be involved by adding to the standards. Teachers and principals need additional training on this, okay? States should have their standards and instruments, assessment instruments reviewed every 5 years, okay? And they should be able to use improving test scores as a way to satisfy AYP, even if they haven't met the criteria, have the scores improved from last year, which improved from the year before. We should be able to use progress as a way to make this better, okay? And then technology and standardized testing, lots of things can be used: practice items, practice tests, test prep programs, computer-based testing programs, computer-based courses that are aligned to the standards and adjusting the level of difficulty.